So I think I'll just begin.
Yes.
Okay. So again, we're talking about the principle of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurin, that a single witness is believed when it comes to matters of Isur v'Heter. Isur v'Heter means, it's not, civil law where money is at stake, not personal status, where marriage or divorce, something like that, is being, weighed. But, let's say things like kashrus, where, prohibitions and mitzvos are on the line, but not, finances or punishments or, consequence of marriage and divorce, etc. So we have this rule that says Eid Echad is Ne'eman B'Isurim, that a single witness is believed in matters of Isur. One of the things I was trying to explain last week is that before we get to a sensational tashbitz, which we'll get to in just a minute, but one of the things I was trying to explain was there seems to be a very interesting argument, partly between Rashi and Tosas. On the side of Rashi, I would say even further than Rashi, the Ramban, the Rajba, the Chachmei Sfarad, against the Balei Tosas. There seems to be a very big debate whether or not there's some reluctance, some hesitation on relying on Eid Echad B'Isurim, or a sense of confidence that we have sufficient information, to rely upon. So the reason I think that is that there are like numerous interesting issues that seem to be debated about the application of this principle. Well, let me explain them.
Eid Echad B'Isurin is only if there is no reason to suspect anything else, right?
Only if there's no reason to suspect that he's a chashud, correct. Like if he's a chashud, this is something that, Rashi.
In other words, the chazaka, the Eid Echad B'Isurin is based on chazaka, no? That cheskas kashrus, if everybody can tell the truth.
Yeah.
If that is impinged in any way by anything, that's why a Korah, for example, has a...
Well, a Korah is Ne'eman and Echad Ne'eman B'Isurin, as long as he's not a chashud. He's not Ne'eman in Eidos, but he's Ne'eman in Ne'emanos. But the exception is like what we call a chashud. And as I think I've explained in the past, and especially when we were in Chulin, there are two aspects to chashud, that make it an exception. And this is like like kashrus supervision or things.
That's why certain of the women are not believed, because they have a something that takes away from the cheskas neman. The 5 women that
most Rishonim are the opinion that women are believed equal to men.
5 women that are not believed, for example, a mother-in-law about certain things.
Oh, you mean in the get, in the Havas, I get, yeah, that mission. Okay, yeah. But that's something very specific, because there's like, there's competitive.
They lost the cheskas kashrus because something intervened that takes away that the chazaka.
Correct. Or for example, let's say you have, again, like taking kashrus, so a chashud is not ne'eman. Chashud has 2 meanings. Number one is like, the person, can be corrupted. He might have his own agenda. That's one thing. But sometimes a chashud is just somebody who doesn't share, the gravity of the issue. Like, let's say somebody's doesn't keep kosher himself, right? And therefore doesn't have an appreciation of it. Doesn't really, he could be a good person. He could even be a moral person.
He doesn't take it seriously.
He doesn't take it seriously because he thinks, it's not a serious matter. He thinks it's, only benighted Jews, believe in that. And he's, very, advanced in his, I'm talking about what the person thinks about himself. Obviously, I don't share this view. So he would think, I'm a very ethical person, but, this is not something, that I need to protect my fellow co-religionists from, because it's nonsense. It's superstition or something like that. So there are 2 types of chashud. There's a chashud who just, doesn't share the gravity of, or the weight of the determination. And then there's one, who could be corrupted. You might have an agenda, you might have a financial interest or something like that, etc. So a chashud, is not ne'eman, but otherwise people are ne'eman. But the big debate that I was talking about before, which is, are we confident? Are we, do we move forward, without any kind of reservation when it comes to Eidach and Bisurim, or is there some sort of do we see it as Chiddush, and we're not like fully subscribed to it? So that seems to be a major debate. So Rashi, as we said before, there are three different Rashis spaced out, over Shas when it comes to, explaining what the source for Eidach and Bisurim is. One Rashi, the Rashi in Chulin, says that when the Torah says v'shachat or v'zavachta, etc., it doesn't say anywhere, that you need conscious police, to verify that. So the assumption is, and then Rashi adds in the end of his piece in Chulin, and when the Torah does want to establish the need for evidence, it does so very unequivocally. Al pi shnayim edim or al pi shnayim u'shlosha edim, Yakum Davar or Yumas Hames. I mean, the Torah knows how to tell you when you
Yakum
need.
Davar is pretty broad.
What?
Yakum Davar is pretty broad.
No, but then we have a Masorah, what it means, the Davar mi Mamon. So, it's either Mamon, it's Erva, so what Rashi is trying to say is, well, if you need evidence there, then the implication is that you don't need evidence elsewhere. So that's Rashi's way of saying we rely on people. It's an optimistic posture, optimistic about humanity or optimistic about our fellow Jews. People are not going to lie. People are reliable, all things being equal, unless they're, Rashi himself says, unless they're a chashud, which I explained before. So what's interesting about Rashi is like, in a way, the default is that you don't need, objective evidence. You just need, to rely on people have credibility. They're, perceived to be honest, all things being equal. And when you do need evidence, that's when the Torah, has to emphasize it.
In a more logical standpoint, can't you simply say that 2 Adam requirement is a chiddush?
That's what Rashi's saying.
Yeah, in other words, basically, we don't have to ask ourselves why 1 is good. We have to understand that 2 is a chiddush.
That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's the implication you get from Rashi. But the takeaway from that is that all things being equal, you can rely on people's honesty and veracity. Why not? They're not going to lie to you for no reason, and therefore you can rely on them. So that when you know that Rashi, and then you read the Rashi here in Gittin, what does the Rashi say here in Gittin on the first page of the Mar Makomos? Shaharehem, the second entry, Shaharehem mina Torah kol echad yechad mi Yisrael, al afrashtas truma al shchita v'al nikur hagid v'hachelev. So that, it's on the one hand, it looks a little strange. That's not a source, that's a statement. Rashi's saying, Eidach and Bisurim, instead of saying like, how do we know this? He's saying, well, we know it. He's telling you where you know it from, but he's not giving you a source, that authorizes you, to rely on it. But in light of Chulin, as you said, the Chiddush is where you need 2 witnesses. Where the Torah doesn't explicate that, why wouldn't you just rely on people's word? So Rashi's saying, yeah, we see this all the time. We see that, when it comes to Truma, when it comes to Shchita, when it comes to Nikra Gid, when it comes to Chelev, we don't find that you need kashrus police, to attest to everything. We rely on the people involved. In Yevamos, this we discussed already, but I'm just sort of getting back to it because I wanted to, establish the pattern. In Yevamos, Rashi goes a step further. If you look on page, let's say 2 in the Mar Makomos, so there Rashi says something which I think is the culmination of these other 2 things, but I'll show you how it was taken differently by someone. If you look at Rashi in Yevamos on Pei Ches Amud Aleph, Jubra Maskil v'Amar Barali de Shumanhu de Mehemen on page 2. So Rashi says, Havadai pshitalon de samchinan alei. It's obvious that we rely on the person's word when he says Barali de Shumanu, that this is kosher meat, right? Kolzman shelo nechshad. That's where he says it, right? As long as the person is the chashud, okay? the ilav hachi ein lecha adam ochel mishal kavera ve'ein lecha adam somechal b'nei beisa. Because if it weren't for the fact that we rely on people, nobody could eat in anybody's house. No one could eat in their own house, except for their own shechita or their own.
But yeah, I thought about that. Why is that an answer? Where do you ever see in halacha? Meaning, maybe you can't eat by people's homes. Meaning,
right, so that's exactly what the Tosas Chad Mikamai in Yevamos says. He says, like, what kind of proof is that? Maybe you can't. Exactly.
Yeah, I remember when they said that,
right. So I think the answer is
refrigerators have lights. They said, well, you can't open your refrigerator on Shabbos. Like the whole world's going to come to an end. So
No,
yeah.
but the question is, you can't eat in your own house.
No, you can.
And then the world does come to an end.
You can eat in your own house only from your own.
You trust
people.
yourself.
Right. So no. So this is the point. If I were to say these words to you, they can be taken in two ways. Okay. One way is the way that you understood it now, and the Tosas Chad Kamai understood it, about 1,000 years ago, and that, or maybe 900, and that is that what Rashi is trying to say is, there has to be a way somehow
to exist.
It's like almost like there can't be this din she'inat tzibur yecholim lamod bo. So there's got to be a way that this works. So, we can reconstruct back in order for it to work. Like, it's so important that people, not be burdened, let's say, to constantly prove that they're eating kosher, that it's just inconceivable, that otherwise, and therefore, we rely on
this extent to a
I don't think that's what, just 1 second. I don't think that's how Tosas Kadmon Kamai understood it. That's how you understood it. And therefore, you both asked a simple question, and that is the Moshe Rabbeinu, I call it the Moshe Rabbeinu perspective. Chazal, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, that Aaron HaKohen, used to look for a compromise, a proper halachic compromise, but a compromise. He was like, the king of Pshara. And they said, like, Moshe Rabbeinu, his motto was Yikov Adin Sahar. Like, the law, wins out no matter what the consequences. So if you have to move the mountain, you move the mountain. If you have to bore through the mountain, you bore through the mountain. Yikov Adin Sahar. So, what Tosas Chad Mikamai and what you're saying is, is very Moshe Rabbeinu-esque. Like, okay, so it'll be tough, it'll be hard, it'll be unpleasant. It certainly won't be convenient, but if this is the law, this is the law. That's part of being, a faith.
We have a cloud that the Torah doesn't do things that are unpleasant.
Well, so you could say Draka Darche Noam if you want, but we never Lomatzinu, when the Gemara says Draka Darche Noam, so that's, that's one thing. Things that are also difficult, but aren't necessarily objectionable. So maybe you need more evidence, But I don't think that's what Rashi. I just don't think that's what Rashi meant. I think you have to read the Rashi in Yevamos in light of the Rashi in Gittin. You have to read both of them in light of the Rashi in Chulin. What Rashi really meant was, of course, there's absolutely no reason. You don't need a makar for Eidach on B'Yisurim. You need a makar for when you need Shnayim Eidim. So this idea that, that you wouldn't be able to eat in your own home or in your neighbor's home, or, it's not that, you need to be able to do that, so we're going to make a concession. Rashi doesn't think it's a concession. Rashi thinks it's just an indication. Like, it's not, there would be no reason why we wouldn't trust people to eat in their home. On the contrary, where you need, extraneous or objective evidence, not just relying on the person's word, that's where, you need a makar.
And
so
that's
why I think Rashi really had.
That's by Dinei Mominus, basically.
Dinei Mominus, the things have to do.
So what happens if you have Eidach and then B'Yisur and kashrus, for example, but it gets into the commercial area? So now you have somebody has a vested commercial financial.
That's where chashud comes into play. If people have.
So will we still say Eidach and Neman?
Well, we say Echad Neman, but again, if the person really has a very strong financial pressures, then you get into.
I mean, kosher meat is more expensive than not kosher meat. I mean, if you're a butcher.
Right. That's where chashud comes into play, right? if you have reason to
But
suspect.
choshed is not just a subjective individual. Choshed usually is a category. So, for
Yeah.
example, a relative, to some degree, is choshed. He could be the most
Well,
honest person in the
again,
world.
the dine erechonem bisurim, all things being equal, there's no psul karov per se, that's for sure. And there's not even necessarily a psul Russia. So, again, we're talking about namanus, we're not talking about edus. We'll get back to that in just a second. I'm going to read you the tashbets. But the point is, Rashi's bigger view, caution aside, is that there's a certain objective, compelling reason to trust people. Rashi taking a very, whether it's cheskas kashrus for Klal Yisrael or more a humanistic, optimistic posture about people, telling the truth, all things being equal. Basically, Rashi's view is that Erechonem Bisurim is a natural, kind of mode. And the need for more is always something that needs to be justified. However, if you look at Balitosis, they need a makar. Balitosis here and in Yevamos and several other places in Shas, they really, like Rashi responds to like how we know Erechonem Bisurim, but he's not, his whole mentality is not, oh, we need to find a makar, otherwise, we're stuck. Whereas the balitosis is, what's the makar? If there's no makar, how can you rely on it? And they end up with a makar. And then they, spend extensive time trying to figure out whether it's a good makar, right? The makar is from Nida, the Safra La, La'atzma, that, she is Nemenes, with respect to her personal status. The Ramban isn't so happy with this. I mean, the Ramban explains that, the reason that she's Nemenes and
She's the only
Nida
person that knows.
is because no one else would know but her, or because it's her,
She
it's
has a lot at stake.
her body, her person, and therefore this is about personal credibility, about a personal issue. But the more we're talking about a broader, theme, maybe that could would mean Bisa. I mean, the Ramban is basically saying, im kvar azkvar. If you think that that's the makar, there are a lot of holes in that makar. But that is the makar that Balitosis throughout Shas quote.
She also has two other problems. One is the fact that the husband, for example, knows that sometime in the month she has to be Anida. So I mean,
Right. So that goes to the
doesn't have too much
problem.
wiggle room.
Right. So we'll get that in a second. That's the issue of this Kazaki Surah and Chazaka Hasuya Lishtanos. So we'll get that in a minute. So issue number one between Rashi and the Balitosis is, do you really need a makar? And what kind of makar? If you didn't have a makar, would you just, would the presumption be that, you need, independent corroboration? Or, you don't need a makar because the presumption is that people are honest and they're telling you the truth. That's point number one. Point number two is that Rashi here in Gittin basically says that the classic case of Erechonem Bisurim is, look at, again, the second entry. Rashi says, Hamina Torah kol echad v'echad miYisrael, al afrashas truma la shchita al nikra agid b'chelev. So according to Rashi, the paradigm cases of Erechonem Bisurim are cases like hafrashas truma, shchita, Gilanasha, etc. So that what bothered Balitosis, if you look at the next at Tosis Gittin base on the base, but look at the second one, it's on the daf or on the page here. So he quotes Rashi, Pirsha Kuntra, Shaimina Torah Kol Echad, Yechad al Afrashas Truma Shchita Nikor Agid B'Chelev, V'Lahoya L'Lahazker Afrashas Truma Shchita. Tosis asks against Rashi, says how could he cite Hafrashas Truma and Shchita as examples of Erechonem Bisurim, the Bahadur Neman Afagav this Chazak Isura. These are cases where there is a presumed Chazaka Keneged, meaning when produce grows in Eretz Yisrael, right, it is Tevel automatically until you're Mafresh Truma. And when an animal is alive until it gets nishkat, you can't eat it because it's Eivra Menachai. And if it isn't shechted properly, if we don't know it's shechted properly, it might be a nevela, or at least it has a category of eina shchuta. So when it comes to
You want to say there's a chazaka issue?
yeah,
But
Tosa is saying if
chazaka
there's
issue changes the minute I come to you with a piece of meat and say this meat was slaughtered correctly. then
well,
the
it only
chazaka
changes.
goes,
It
"My
only
God,
changes if we believe you. The question is, should we believe you to override what was previously in the process of this?
And the litmus test is chazaka, and the chazaka just changed in my favor.
No.
Until the cow was slaughtered,
Well, this is what the Gemara said. The Gemara says here, if you go back to the Gemara, our Gemara, or the Gemara Nivamos, the Gemara says, listen, go back to the first entry. The Gemara says, Rabbi says that you need fanei because we're worried that he omitted the requirement of a get lishma, of being very specific. So the Gemara says, well, yeah, but then if that's the case, liboy trey, you should need two witnesses. Why? Like any other, testimony in the Torah. Says the Gemara, no, say that's how this gets introduced into our topic. So then the Gemara says, the lowest chazak isura. So basically what the Gemara says is as follows. That's when you don't have any previous status quo. You're not claiming that something changed for the better or for the worse. You have this unidentified neutral, let's say, again, take the class. You have a piece of meat, right? You don't know whether it came from the kosher butcher shop or the treifa butcher shop, right? So we're now identifying where it came from. We're saying, oh, it's kosher meat, not, but this meat doesn't have a history as meat, right? But what the Gemara is saying is, but if it did, like an Eishasish, right? The Eid Echad is coming along now to say that there was lishma. He's saying you can't believe him because she's becheskas Eishasish. You have to override her previous status quo ante, right, in order to be matir her l'shuk. This get's only going to work, if you override her status prior to the get, which is Eishasish. So this is the Gemara, and same Gemara Nivam. Look at the Gemara Nivam just for a minute.
So the entire reason we believe a woman by a husband's death is because of the aguna. Otherwise, we'd follow the same format you just said right now.
Yeah, that is the Gemara Nivam. That's what the Gemara Nivam is actually about. So look on page 2 for a minute. That's exactly correct. Look on page 2. It says Talmud Bavli Masachet Yevamos Daf Pei Zayin Amud Beis. So this is the Mishnah there talks about believing in Eid Echad, about Misa Sabal. If an Eid Echad comes to court and says that this husband of this woman is deceased, then we believe him. So the Gemara is discussing this. Gemara
Even though the Cheskas ante was that she was an Eishasish.
Yeah. So the Gemara says, Miktani Seif Anisa Shalom Brishus Muteris Lachsarlo. Okay, the diuk is not important for us for the moment. Shalom Brishus Bezdin Ela Be'edim. The Chal de Reisha, the case in the Reisha of the Mishnah is Birshus Bezdin Ubeid Echad, meaning an Eid Echad came to court, testified that her husband is deceased, and the Bezdin gave her a heter to resume her life, to remarry. So the Gemara says, you see from here, Alma Eid Echad Neman. You see from here that an Eid Echad is Neman B'misa Sabal, to establish that the husband is no longer alive, and therefore to free her to marry someone else. So then the Gemara says, Utananami, we have another Mishnah also, Huxikolios Masian, Eid mi pi Eid, the Isha mi pi Isha, the Isha mi pi Eved, Umi pi Shivcha, and other sources that also indicate that it doesn't have to be even an Eid Echad Kasher, it could be hearsay, it could be, the source could be, somebody who's not kosher le'edus, but is neman. Alma Eid Echad Nehemed. Utsananami, another makar. Eid echad amar chalta chelev. When Eid echad accuses someone of eating, he says, "Oh, you ate chelev, or you're chayv malchus." Who amar lo achalti? I didn't do it. Potter. So the Gemara says, fine, Talmud the amar lo achalti, because he put up an objection, he contradicted the Eid echad. That's why, we don't believe him. Ha'ishtik. But if he said, "Oh, I wasn't paying attention," right? So the only source is the Eid echad, then that would be Neman. Al Eid echad meheman midoraisa. So we see that an Eid echad min Torah can be, can be believed. Now you don't always need two. Says the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Minalan." How do you know this is true? The Tanya, "Ohodai lav chataso, below sheyodiuhu acherim, yochal afa b'sheinu makhisho yehe patur, Talmud lomar ahodai lav mikol mako echadami." Again, the details of this aren't important in the moment. Ile medasu trei velo kamakshile kroalamali elalav chad v'chilo makhishle mehemet. So again, another proof that if you have a single witness and he's not contradicted by either the Baldavar or anyone else, that we apply, halachic consequences to the, statement, to the credibility of a single aid.
There's never a havamina that maybe it's okay, let's say, to say that that's not also, but not okay to the chai of somebody.
No, so the next line of the Gemara, let's just finish the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Umi mai de mishum de mehemen." Maybe the only reason we believe they echad is dilma mishum de kashasik or shtika kaudadami. Teda, says the Gemara, this the Ktani Seifa Amru Shnayim Achalta Chelev. Like the Omer Lo Achalti Patner. So Reb Meir Mechayev, Omer Reb Meir Kav Chomer, Meviu Shnayim L'Demis Chamor Lo Yeviu Disakal. Omer L'Mayim Yertzel Omer Mezer Ayisi, and so on. I don't know where the rest of the Gemara went. 1 second. Reisha, I don't know what happened. Somehow when I copied this, I'm guessing it's somewhere else on the page here, but if I can't find it, I'll just. I don't know. It seems like it got cut off somewhere. But either way, the Gemara then goes on to say, listen, Eid echad neman b'isurim is fine if it's not keneged as chazak isura. But if it's keneged as chazak isura, it doesn't work. So then the Gemara says, well, how come shchita and hafrashas truma and chelev, how come we believe they echad then? The Gemara says, because it's biyado letakein, which means that I could change the chazaka, right? Not even if there's a chazkas iser, the two shebel. But since I could
change the shchita if you did it already.
Right, but so that's what the Bali Tosis point out, that the ability, biyado, what we call biyado, is even if it isn't biyado now, since it was biyado, somehow that helps.
A concept of brera bringing in here or what?
No. So I'll explain in a minute. So if you go back to now to Tosis on base here, the one in Gittin, Tosis says, isn't it strange that Rashi considers, shchita, truma, chelev, giranasha to be examples of Eid echad neman b'isurim? After all, they're all cases of Chazak Isura. And if you look carefully at Rashi, look at the second Rashi. Hacha is Chazik.
Right.
The Hach is Yisrael Shasish. And then Rashi adds, Umitavel shchita lo gamrina ma, kiramina biyavamos, the hasa biyada letaknan, lefikach neman lahoid aleim. So Rashi basically says, the Gemara here says that you don't believe in Eid echad keneged as chazak isura. So, but didn't we just say a minute ago that we do believe the Eid echad, and that the example of Eid echad nem bisurim is shchita and truma and chelev and giranasha? So Rashi says, yeah, that's because it's biyado letaknan. So Tosa says, even Rashi's admitting that if not for biyado letaknan, Eid echad would not be neman keneged as chazak isura. So why is he giving that as the example? 2 minutes earlier. So the answer is as follows. So what the answer for Tosfos is, I'll go back to Tosfos now. Tosfos says, Ubasama, I'm sorry, 1 second. Commotion Pierce Basama, that you said Rashi himself, makes this point. But then it negates what he said a sentence earlier. That how could Rashi say the paradigm case is these cases, and then 2 sentences later he says, "Oh, by the way, these cases they go against the rule, but there's an explanation beyond all the take." So Hachyamar Ba'isha Rabba says Tosas, "Ushchita afagav dehashta ein biyado letakno miikara biyado lishcho." That's your question. Even though shchita is nothing you can do about it right now because you can't dial back, history, right? But at the time it was biyado. Dimlo ken amay mehem and kivin dischazik isura. The lo matzinu shum makom sheitzarech begadol echad omed al gaba of a ma'isa b'chol yom demehem. And no one ever said that the only time you can eat meat is if you have corroboration of 2 witnesses. Everybody seems to be relying on an eid echad when it comes to shchita. Afagav dolo shayich robinson eitza shchita. Not even a rove. Kagon shenechtach kol harosh. Ein beis shchita nikar. Masha anu somchem al nashim b'shchita. Oh, that's a different story. Okay, so what's the answer? So vim tomar minalon eid echad now.
Yodo is talking like a migui.
So the rush, and that's a great question. If it was really like a migu,
Sure sounds like it.
oh, hi. I see one of our veteran Talmidim has returned. Good to see you. Thank you. So the if it really was a kind of a migu, then it would have to be possible to do it right now. So with the Ramban, I'm sorry, with the Rush in Daf.
Why is that a criteria of migui?
Because migu always.
I could have said a better thing before, not now.
Right. We call that normally migu lemafreya, and we typically say there's a famous Tosas in Bava Basra and Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. Tosas says that's called migu lemafreya and migu lemafreya lo amrinan. And with the Rush, if you look at the Rush in Hanizakin in the 5th parak of Gittin, he says don't think that biyado letakin is a kind of a migu. It's almost like he's exactly, anticipating your point. He says, because if that were true, it would always have to be forward-looking. It would always have to be something that you could do right now going forward. He said, no, what it really is a kind of— It
means I have a better option, but if you don't have it now, it's not a better option.
Right, then it's not a better option, so it doesn't give you credibility. But you just, you made a decision, and now you're working with that. But what Rush says something very profound, and this got picked up by everybody, and that the Rush says, no, the real idea is it's a kind of bailus, meaning if it's something you can change, so that gives you like a certain authority or a certain agency. Is that what you said? Yeah.
Can change it,
not in the shlichos sense, but in the control sense, right?
Yochel Atakin is present or also past?
Yeah, because meaning this is something that is uniquely connected to you and to your ability here. That's
this moment, or you could have done it earlier.
Even if the whole point is, the proof is that that even if you could have done it earlier, the fact that it was biyadcha makes it your domain. It's a way of defining.
So it is a bailus issue, basically.
What?
It is a bailus issue, basically.
Bailus, yeah. But bailus is not migu at all. Anyway, that's Tosas. So Tosas ends up thinking the following. This is my second point. Tosas thinks, number one, you need a makar for Eidechonem Bisurim. Number two, Eidechonem Bisurim doesn't work at all if it's Ischazik Isura. You cannot climb that mountain. You can't override Ischazik Isura. You just can't. What about all these cases that we believe the person? Oh, that's because of biyado. But for Tosas, like the Rush, biyado is bailus. It's a totally different category. It's a different basis for credibility. It's not Eidechonem and Bisurim. It's something different than that. What about Rashi? Doesn't Tosas have a good claim against Rashi? Doesn't Rashi seem to contradict himself? Tochidei dibur. practically, in the next sentence, he says, oh, the paradigm, the blueprint for Ein Echad Nem Bisurim is Tevel and Shchita and Chelev and Gid. And then the next sentence, he tells you that if not for Biado Latakein, based on the Gemara Yevamos, if not for Biado Latakein, the whole thing wouldn't work because it's connected as Chazak Yisura. Tosa says, what's Rashi talking about? So the Chidushe Haran and the Marik and others say, they all say the same thing. And clearly this is the right shot. They say, oh, what Rashi has in mind is the following. Rashi didn't read the Gemara in Yevamos like Tosas did, which is, the Aved Echad, it only works if it's not as Chazak Yisura. It's Chazak Yisura, that's a different basis, Biyado. Rather, Rashi understood that Biyado is an internal factor in Ein Echad Nem Bisurim. It's a way of neutral. It's like, oh, Ein Echad Nem Bisurim will work connected as Chazak Yisura as long as it's Biyado. I mean, Biyado isn't Bailus. Biyado is a way of neutralizing the impact of his Chazak Yisura. Meaning, how deeply entrenched is this as Chazak Yisura if it's Biyado Latakein? So technically, it might be as Chazak Yisura, right? Meaning the presumptive state, is, opposite of that what the Ein Echad is now claiming, and that might have been a formidable hurdle, maybe one that could never be overcome. But the Biyado kind of lessens, moderates, or maybe even completely neutralizes the impact of Cheskas Iser, or it allows Ein Echad Nem Bisurim to work, even if it's a Chazak Yisura. So what ends up, happening is that there are 2 points. Rashi says you don't really need a makar, A, and number 2, Ein Echad can really work in Keneged as Chazak Yisura as long as it's Biyado.
Well, the chazaka is very weak chazaka that gets impacted if there's a cheskas isura, and
Right.
then it gets further tilted back on the seesaw if you can.
Right. But so what I'm trying to say is that A, Rashi feels a sense of confidence about Ein Echad Nem Bisurim. Tosas, thinks you need a makar. B, Rashi thinks that the expanse, the impact, right, the capacity of Ein Echad Nem Bisurim, far surpasses what Tosas thinks. I'll go further. The Ramban and the Rajba paskin Ein Echad is Nem Keneged as Chazak Yisura, even without Biyado Latake. What do they do with the Gemara in Yevamos and with our Gemara? So it's interesting. The Rajba basically says in Yevamos and also in some Chuvas that there's an argument between different Gemaras about this issue, whether Ein Echad is Neman Keneged as Chazak Yisura. Our Gemara in Gittin and Yevamos say no, but there's other Gemaras in Gittin later on in Hanizakin and the Gemara in Perka Omer and Kiddushin, Samachay. There are other Gemaras, some Gemaras in Chulin. They imply that Ein Echad is Neman B'Isurim, even Keneged is Chazak Yisura. And therefore, there's an argument between different sources, and we paskin like the ones who say that Ein Echad is Neman Keneged is Chazak Yisura. And if you look at Shulchan Aruch in Yeridea, Siman Kuf Chav Zayin, which is where most of the main material about Ein Echad Nem Bisurim is discussed, it's actually very interesting because the context is Hilchos Kuf Nun Zayin is in Yeridea is Hilchos Stam Yenam or Yain.
How did the Rif and the Rambam rule on this?
It's hard to pin them down on the question of this Chazak Yisura, but let me just say this. So if you look at Shulchan Aruch, it's a huge debate. Some of the poskim say we paskin. By the way, let me just go a step further. The Ramban says the whole thing is not even a machlokas with different Gemaras. He says our Gemara here was just saying, maybe Ein Echad doesn't work again as Chazak Yisura. And that's what the Gemara in Yevamos was saying. They weren't really saying it definitively. It was more like L'chedude. You look at the Ramban and Yevamos, look here in our Makomos on page, I think it's 3. If you'll see it says Chidush Ramban Yevamos Pei Ches Amud Aleph, starting from Midami. And if you go to the end of the last paragraph of that, utmiali, I have it boldened a little bit. Utmiali l'mayde kamrin and hashta hechad is chazik isur lo mehemen. Says according to the simple reading of the Gemara, the Eidachad is not neman against the chazik isura when there's a presumptive state, right? Elamayata mata tarnagola shchuta. If you find a chicken, and clearly it's been shechted, bashuk, or ba'ashpa, or somebody tries to throw it out, uboy Yisrael v'amar ksherahi, and the Yisrael comes and says it's kosher, right? Meaning Eidachad neman b'isurim. Shebefanai nishkata, I saw that the shchita was proper. Milo mehemen, says the Ramban, we wouldn't believe that. Yafal bisha huksaka beisur shebeheva b'chayah b'chaskas isur omedes. B'hareim nevela he ain't biyado. What are you gonna say? Biyado letakein says if it's a nevela, it's not biyado. It's not always biyado letakein. Dafil b'shalatzma lehein neman. Never mind, he wouldn't be Naaman to feed other people. He even wouldn't be Naaman to feed himself unless he himself was the shochet. Yeah, says the Ramban. Just to continue a little bit. So he says, "Ela sugyazu she'elos be'almaninu midaraisa minalan u'liola medecha nema b'chol Yisrael." This is a very remarkable conclusion. The Ramban basically says, even though the Gemara in Yevamos does seem to conclude that Eidachad is not neman to override this Chazik Isura, it's more like, the Gemara is trying to say, how do you know? It's like playing devil's advocate. Like, how do you know? Maybe this is the limit. Maybe prove to me that it's not the limit. But the actual conclusion, all over Shas, according to the Ramban, is that Eidachad is neman keneged as chazik isura even without biyado. So if you look in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kuf Chav Zayin, at the Machaber and the Ramah and the Shach.
Bali Tosfos are not aware of what's going on in the Gemara.
No, on the contrary, the simple reading of the Gemara supports the Bali Tosfos.
I'm saying,
The Ramban is saying two things. Number one, there are other Gemaras. Number two, it's a little bit like, can this be?
They were only musing when they said this. They weren't saying it. Is that the idea?
They were saying, how do you know? Maybe it's limited. Maybe it's, give me better proof. So in the end up for Eidachad b'misa sabao in the Sugin Yevamos, and for B'fanei Nachtam and Gittin, the Gemara ends up saying, yeah, you're right. It isn't based on Eidachad Neman B'Surah. What the Ramban is saying is, this was the Gemara, it's like giving a hard time. It's like, prove it to me. How do you know? But, when you look at everything combined, that doesn't mean that that's the Gemara's firm conclusion.
And the two sources of the Mechaber say nothing about it, then we expect him to say something?
The who?
The Mechaber is relying on the Rambam and the Rebbe.
I'm just saying, if you look in the post, this is a well-known argument. I mean, the Tosas and the Rosh insist, and you can totally on the merit of Yevamos, Peches, and Gittin, first parak, they're totally right that Eidachad is not neman keneged as chazik isura if it's not biyada l'take. The Ramban and the Rajba, whether it's based on other sugyos or their conviction also based on other sugyos, that even the Gemaras here are kind of just, pushing are saying, how do you know? But they're not really saying definitively, no. They're arguing that la halacha Eidachad is neman keneged as chazik isura. Now, this is well known that this is a debate between Balei Tosas and Chachmei Sfarad. And then if you look in the poskim in Shulchan Aruch, there's a divide. There's some who go one way and some who go the other way. Both of these positions, had their impact. So I believe the Shach, ends up holding like the Ramban, if memory serves me correctly. But you'll see it's all played out in in Shulchan Aruch as well. But the upshot of it all is like now taking it. Let's take it in isolation for a moment. So there's an argument: do you really need a source for Eidachad Neman B'Surim, or default, you should just believe it because, like, why not? People are not liars unless we know they are. That's one debate. Then comes a second debate. Even if you believe there's a concept or a category called Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, is it strong enough to override Cheskas Iser? The answer is, according to Ramban, yes, and Rajba, yes. Tosas and Rosh, no, and Rashi somewhere in between, because Rashi says that according to Rashi, the biyado letakein is midin Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. According to Tosas, it's not. That's an interesting argument. So what I'm saying is, those are not coincidental arguments here. Basically, the Baalei Tosas are hesitant, they're reticent, they're not, they think that relying on a single source is is the halacha that you can rely on it when you can rely on it, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some question marks. Whereas the Rashi and especially the Ramban and Rajba say no, just the threshold of what you need, to rely on in Isurim has been met, and we rely on Eid Echad with confidence, and even Keneged Chazak Isura. Right now, a rove, and his Sveka, this question of his Chazak Isura, again, just to highlight it a little more. Let's say there are other sources of call it information or at least factors or considerations to weigh, in other halachic contexts, as we know, like a rove, probability, chazaka, the presumptive states, sveka daraisa l'chumra, sveka drabanan l'kula. We have all sorts of rules we've discussed, in other, topics. This has come up a lot. Every year it comes up in one way or another, right? What do you do if you don't have, certitude? When there's a suffix, when there's doubt, how do you push forward in the world of halacha? So the answers are all these principles: rov, chazaka, migu, peshasar, right? Sveka drabanan, sveka daraisa. So the clash, occasionally there's a clash between these factors. For example, migu. Migu means if I have a better lie, then if what I say is more moderate and I'm not using my best lie, then you should believe me that I'm telling you the truth. That's a migu. Migu di boy amar X, neman lomar Y. But let's say you have a migu and it's against the chazaka. Like your migu wants to override the presumptive state. Do we believe migu neged chazaka? That's a huge debate. Baalei Tosas in the beginning of Bab Mitzia and all over the place say migu lahotzi lo amrina, which means migu against a chazaka of motzi mechavero alavaraya. We don't say, and the Ramban says we do. We say migu keneged, chazaka. So svek sveka, the Rajba has a famous tshuva. A svek sveka means you have a double doubt. Like let's say
has to be on the same issue.
Well, I mean that's a debate, but we've talked about it in the past a little bit. That's called suffek echad beguf, suffek echad betaroves. So, but you're right. I mean, it has to be the kind of thing where you can't just resolve. It's not two single suffix, each of which is resolved independently. That somehow these two things come together. Either you can flip them, like let's call it svek sveka hamisapeches, or it has to be, so again, suffix shtei svekos betaroves or shtei svekos beguf.
Basically diluting the original suffix. That's the whole.
Yeah, but I don't want to get into svek sveka right now, but because that'll take us far afield. I only want to make the following point about svek sveka, and that is that in a tshuva of the Rajba, in Siman Tuf, Chelik Aleph Siman Tuf Beis, famous tshuva, the Rajba weighs or was asked to weigh, does svek sveka, like a double suffix, override a chazaka? I'm just trying to show you. Anyways, the Rajba discusses this. He says, well, if a rove overrides a chazaka, then svek sveka is not worse than a rove. I don't care about this right now. I mean, I do, but I don't want to get into this right now.
I mean, rove is very strong. Rove is a very strong concept, because because a rove basically is
Well,
treated
rove is probability, but yeah,
as a factual, because it's probability, it's treated as a factual issue.
yeah, but not everybody will agree. If there's a minority, I mean, look, even in our Gemara, Rab Meir is always chayish lemiuta, right? So
Yeah, then all of these things fall by the wayside.
no, because this is really what we're talking about. Meaning, what I'm trying to show you is that when we talk about whether like something like Edechad Neman Bisurim and how comfortable we are relying on it, do we consider it to be like a concession that you're relying on? After all, if it had been Dina Baminis or Dina Ishus or something like that, we would have required Ksherim and we would have required two, and we would require that this be, playing out in a Besdin, all these things. So the question then is, so the threshold for Isurim is less, but we're still, totally confident and relying on it. That's what I'm suggesting is the view of Rashi and the Ramban. Or no, the very fact that it's less of a, less, demanding or less requirements than, than we encounter in these other areas, they show that it's a compromise in a way. You can compromise because the stakes are lower. And that's, I think, what Tosa say. So what I'm trying to show you is that this is not a question only to look at in a vacuum. Like, you have this category called an Echonem and Bisurim. It's significantly less demanding than two witnesses in a court. And we're trying to figure out, how it works. What I'm trying to say is there's a whole list of, we'll call them sources of, information, in halakha that, are not foolproof for sure, but that we rely on in different contexts, some of which we do and some we don't. It's like we say, ein holchem b'mamonach, ein holchem mamonach arov, right? But we also say that ruba v'chazaka, ruba adif, a rove beats out a chazaka, all things being
That's
equal.
what I meant when I
A
said
rove doesn't work in mammon.
very strong factor rove. That's what I'm saying.
We discussed some years ago when we learned the Psachim and Chulin, what about, when it comes to a rove, do we say efshel lavar or tzarich lavar? Can you rely on a rove even if you could find out even more? Like, why should I rely on probability if I could find out in this case 100%? Do you have that obligation? The more you think that rove is like very reliable, the more you don't even have to
That was
bother.
focus on that point. No?
It is a machlokas. Machlokas between the Balamar and the Ramban and the Rajba and the Ra. It's a very lively machlokas, 100%. So what I'm trying to show is that if you look at independently, migu, and each one of these has complications, like migu peshasa, migu rove, there are different types of roves, chazaka, sveksveka, eidachod neman bisurim, eidachod b'shvua, the special nemanos. The Gemara says that based on the pasuk, as biti nasati leishazeh, that a father has special nemanus about his minor daughter's marital status. We believe him the special din, not eidachad bisurim, not it doesn't need other. It's a special din as biti nasati leishazeh. A father has special nemanus to identify the hierarchy of his krovim based on the pasuk in Parshas Kitetse. When it comes to Bachor, the Torah uses the expression Yakir. So there's a special, according to some, special nemanus, special credibility that a father has to identify his heirs based on the principle of Yakir. So all these things, they're all on the same level? Are they all the same level of certitude? Or is there a range? And things like, do they beat out cheskas iser? Do they work, et cetera, et cetera? This is a massive argument. So the argument between Rashi and Tosas and the Ramban and the Rajba and so on about A, the makar for Eidachad Isur, B, the question of the cheskas isur is very relevant. Let me give you a couple of other examples. So when it comes to Eidos, for example, we have a rule, that we discussed a lot when we talked about Reish Lakish, right? Based on the language of Reish Lakish is the application to shtar, but it's the principle of kivit shehigid shuven echol zer magid. What that means is in a court setting, or when it comes to actual real evidence, real testimony,
Can't retract.
so you have like one up mostly, there are some exceptions, but mostly the rule is that you have one opportunity to testify, and you can't clarify, never mind recant. Kivin shehigid, once you testify, shuva nechozer mag. Now again, what is that based on? Is that based on the Kabbalah's Edus of Bezdin, an opportunity in front of Bezdin, or is it just the power of, you
It
can't.
may be a logical issue that you have to have closure. I mean,
Exactly. Right. So from a policy point of view, or also from a credibility point of view, in other words, the more you think that two witnesses who testify in court are establishing a truth, beyond any kind of question, Trey Kamea, the more understandable it is that they can't recant or even clarify, because we're putting so much weight on the veracity of what they're saying, that to, as you say, not to close it, would be inviting trouble from a policy point of view, but also just objectively would undercut. If you can constantly clarify or even recant, even worse, then how can this be factual, right? Anyways, we have this rule. That's number one. However, there's another rule out there in the world of halacha. If you look at the Mishnah in Ksubis and Avchaf Beis Amud Beis, so the Gemara tells a story. I should have put it on the Marmakomos, but I don't think I did. So just give me 1 second. I'm just going to quote the Gemara, because it's always better when you quote it. And that's the advantage of, sitting in my library. So the Gemara on Chaf Beis Amud Beis, Chaf Beis Amud Aleph, has the following story. The Mishnah actually says, so Isha Shamra Eshes Isha Yisi, Ugrushani Nemenes. If a woman says, I used to be married, but now I'm divorced, we believe her.
That's amigo.
Because of Peshas or Peshahitter, which is like amigo. A Peshas or Peshahitter, the Mishnah says, because we wouldn't know that she was married if not her say so. And therefore, for trusting her that she was married, we trust her. Pesha Asar, if she, is believed to put herself, out of the marriage market, then the Pesha Hitter, we believe her fully, to establish that that's just in the past and that she is Muteris L'Shuk. Anyways, the Gemara then has the following discussion. Ton Rabbana, Ha'isha Sha'amra Esha Shani, a woman comes, this is like, a classic. She makes a statement. She says, I'm married. And then, a few days later, she says, I'm a pnuya. Nemens. Okay. So the Gemara says, right? This is days later. Why do we believe her? I mean, when she said that she was married, she was saying, I can't marry anybody else. Now she's not saying I got divorced. She's saying Pnuyani.
She said it in front of Bezdin as a means of some certification, or she just was having a conversation?
Yeah, let's say she went to, she may have gone to, she went to Bezdin, she didn't go to Bezdin. Either way, it's not Eidos.
Right.
But the Gemara says, well, but what happened is a principle called Shavinav Shechaticha D'Yisura, which is that if she makes a statement about herself that has, legal implications, those are binding. So what happened to that? So the Gemara says the following: Amarava Baravuna Kagon Shenasna Amaslo Lidvareha. We're talking about a case where she explains, she provides an excuse, we'll call it. She rationalizes her statements. Well, how would that be? What would that be? Tanya Namihachi, Amra Isha Sishani. She says, I'm a married woman. Because of Yomra Pnuyani, Ein Nemenes. Vimnosna Masal Dvara Nemenes. Umaysanami Beisha Achas Gedola. So the Gemara tells there actually was such a story. This woman was she was of age, right? So I said Gedola, and not only that, but she was Gedola Benoi. She was a very good marriage candidate. The kafzola b'nei adam l'kadsha. So everybody was, proposing to her. The Amar Lahem, she would say to them, I'm so sorry, I would have loved to accept your marriage proposal, except that Mekudesha Sani, I'm already married. Right? So far, so good.
The means of putting them off.
Yeah, so exactly. So the Gemara says, Liyamim, a few days later, Amda Vikidsha as Hatzma. 3 days later, 5 days later, 10 days later, she's announcing her marriage to some, other person. So Amar Chachamim, the Chacham said, Ma Rayis Lasos came. Right? Like, what's going on here? You just told everybody that you were married already. So she explained, originally I was getting all these offers from people who were inappropriate. Instead of saying to them, I would never marry you, she said, she said, look, I'm wearing a ring, I'm married already. Amarti mikudashasani. Achshav shabo alay anashim mehuganim, amadti vikidashti yasatsi. Right? And the Gemara says this is the din. So that's the din of a masla. That's called the din of a masla. A masla means that an understandable explanation, or rationalization of recanting something you said earlier. Now it's clear that a masla, right, would not work for Eidim, because it's contradicted by the principle of kivin shigit shuman achazer magid. The question is, does it only work where the Gemara has it, which is shavya nafsha chaticha de isura, where she herself is the source, or let's say it was Eid Echad Neman Bisurim. Right, let's say Eid Echad came to court and said, whatever. This is kosher meat or something like that. Okay, and then the Eid Echad turned around a day later and he said, it wasn't kosher meat. And let's say he explained it. He said, listen, they caught me eating it, so I didn't want to look bad. I said it's kosher meat, but now I'm telling you the truth. It's not kosher meat. All right. So that you gave it a masla, the Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim gave it a masla. Would that work? Or is it only? So the answer is, objectively, it's somewhere, again, Shavi Navshachah Ticha D'Yisura, a masla works. Eidos doesn't work. There's a lot in between. So, really there's a machlokas, the Chachmei Provence, some of the Rishonim in southern France debated this question. Some of them said it works in Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim and a masla, and others said no. But what I'm trying to point out is, the more you think Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim is like, hard, fast truth, that's the threshold that you need and you have in Yisurim, so maybe there's no masla. If it's more of an iffy, you can rely on it, but we don't really fully trust it anyway, then it's possible, that a masla will help. If it's a din in if the reason a masla doesn't help in Eidos is because of Bezdin, there's no Bezdin, no Kabbalah Eidos in Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim either. So what I'm just trying to show is, like, the methodology is, is Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim for Isurim what Eidos is for Mammon and for Ishus, and so on, and the same kind of rules mostly apply? Or no, it's the drop off is enormous, because in one case we're talking about Trei Kameya fact. We're saying 2 Eidim is like facts, and in the other case what we're saying is that we don't have facts here, but it's good enough to rely on. You can eat the meat. You can eat at your friend's house if you trust him and he tells you that the meat is kosher. So. But if he then turns around and he says, you know what, there was a reason I said what I said, but I didn't really mean it, you wouldn't necessarily have to be using the standards of Eidos you might be able to get away with the standards of Shavi Nafsha Chatecha Surah, in assessing that. I'll give you another example. And I think we're going to have to stop after this one. And then we're going to figure out what happens, whether this is our last year or whether we have one more. But I'll give you one other example. If you look at the Rambam, I mentioned this, I believe, last time, but let's look at it more seriously. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Tazayin, Halacha Vav, I believe this is the end of page 3 or the beginning of page 4. Anybody have it there? It's Rambam Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Tazayin, Halacha Hey through Vav. And then it says Halacha Vav. I think it's the end of page 3, but it could be the very beginning of page.
Halacha Vav is the bottom of page 3.
Yeah. Okay, great. So this is what the Rambam says. Thank you. Eino tzarich shnei edim lamalkis. You don't need 2 witnesses for a din Torah, for a lawsuit, a law, deliberation regarding imposing the penalty of malchus. Ela b'shas ma'isa. Only if we're talking about a discussion or deliberation, that revolves around the moment or the timing of the avera itself. Like, let's say, we'll see in a moment. Aval isur atzmo, this is the key line of the Rambam, be'ed echad yuchsak. The prohibition itself can be established by a single witness. What does that mean? So he explains. Ketzad, for example, Amar eid echad chelev klayos. You have a single witness, eid echad nemun bisurim, in other words, comes to court and he says, this object here is chelev, the chelev that you're not allowed to eat. Or kilai kerem perus elu. This fruit are, kilayim bekerem. You're not allowed to eat them. Or this individual, this woman that you're thinking of marrying, or that whatever, she's a grusha. Therefore, she can't marry a Kohen. O zona ishazu. Okay, she can't marry a Kohen. And then, after this has been identified in court, so then v'ochal o ba'al be'edim achar shehisrabo. After this was established in court, then somebody or the person in question does the action. So you have the eid echad coming prospectively and defining, let's say that they take the food case, it's the easiest one, defining this as non-kosher food, and then the individual in question picks it up and eats it. So the Rambam says, in that circumstance, loka on nisraf on niskal, depending on what the case is, afal b'shein shamraya brura shizu yachoso imo bito ela b'chazaka bilvad. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped them in the wrong Rambam. Sorry. Hareza loka afal b'sheikar isar be'ed echad. Even though the primary establishment of the isar is done by eid echad, nonetheless, because that is before the avera, if the person then acts on it, right, we consider it to be factual. It got in through the back door, basically. Okay? That's, of course, assuming that there was no objection. When this, was established in court to be chelev, no one jumped up and said, I disagree. I dissent. If there's some controversy, whether this is kosher or not kosher, whether she is muteris l'kohen or not, etc., then without 2 witnesses, obviously, you're not going to establish anything. But this is a very fascinating issue, because if there's any real question about whether we rely fully, with confidence, in other words, unequivocally, on eid echad nemun be'isurim, then how could it ever be applied, no matter what the order, to Malchus or Misa, or anything like, or Mammon or anything like that? But if we're confident in Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, just that when it comes to, Dinam Bezdin, Eidos, etc., we have different. There we raise the stakes. There we need not just Nemanus, but Eidos, etc. Then that's a different story. As long as this gets in through the back door, as long as it's established in advance that this is Chela, we believe it fully on an Isser level. Then if the person does something with it that constitutes a prohibition, right, that's an application. So we've talked about 4 different issues. Do you need a source for Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, or is it presumed, default to be the case? And the Chiddush is, on the contrary, when do you need real Eidos? That's question number 1, that divides the Rishonim. Question number 2, is Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim even overriding like contrary evidence or contrary factors, I should say, like is Chazak Yisura? Right, Tosas and the Rosh say no, unless it's Bi'adol L'Takein, which is a whole different category. But Eid Echad can never override this Chazak Yisura. Rashi says if it's Bi'adol L'Takein, then Eid Echad could even override this Chazak Yisura. The Ramban and the Rashba say that Lahalacha Eid Echad is never connected to Chazak Yisura, even without Bi'adol L'Takein. So once again, a debate about the perspective or the effect of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. That's another example. The next example we discussed tonight was the question: when do you apply the equivalent of Kivin Shig and Shuman Chozer Magid? When do you apply, the alternative, which is no snim amasla, ledvara? Like when can you, clarify, partially recant, provide, a justification, etc. And when are you, do you have to stick with your story? Like you have one opportunity, that is legally, all you have. You can't, adjust or alter your eidos. That's a third issue where how we look at Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim seems to be at play. And then you have a fourth question that we're discussing now, and that is, can information that is has its source in Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, can that information in turn, be employed for Malchus, for Misa, for Mammon, etc. As long as it's not it doesn't violate like the formal rules of Kabbalah Sedus and the necessary threshold in a more direct way. But let's say if indirectly, if Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim can establish factually the identity or the the character of something, it's kosher, it's not kosher, she's a Gusha, she's not, etc., etc. Can we even rely on that, when it comes to harsher consequences? You can only do that if there's a level of confidence, not just the kind of, b'di'evad, what can we do? We have to a resigned, kind of compromise, but more of a confident, confident, assertion, that this is, if not Eidos, but it is at least Namanis. Now the Tashbetz, I'm going to stop here now, but if we get a chance, we'll maybe discuss. The Tashbetz goes even further. The Tashbetz, in an interesting tshuva, basically suggests that Eid Echad would have been enough for Eidos, and Erev, all things being equal. It's not, but it would have been in theory, because Eid Echad has a very considerable credibility, and that Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim is an echo of that level of confidence in the words of an Eid Echad, that it's also in theory applicable even to erva and mammon, and other things. So in fact there are differences, but that there's no fundamental difference between the nemanus of Eid Echad B'Yisurim and the edus of Shnayim Eidim in principle. And the way that he comes to that is just very fascinating. So we're going to stop here for tonight. The question is, next Tuesday, I am otherwise occupied, so I can't make it next Tuesday. But if there is an interest, we could do one more share before we
So you
disband for the summer. We could do it next Wednesday. That's possible.
were you thinking 7 at the same time, or earlier, or a different time on Wednesday night?
Whatever on the Wednesday. Let me just check my calendar. It could be
Sure.
whatever is good for the group. If you want to do one more, which I'm happy to do. 1 second, let me just check. Let's see. Yeah, it's whatever time is good for the group. Just
So
have
we
to
say
figure out
an hour, like 7 to 8. What were you thinking, Rabbi? Like an hour?
whatever you want.
Okay. Who else is available Wednesday
We can
night?
do an hour and
7
a
to 8?
half like we usually do. It's whatever you want.
Okay.
If you want to do 7:39 as usual, that's what works.
Okay,
I'm
great.
available.
Okay, great. So we'll do one more. Maybe I'll talk
So-
about that Ashbet and a few other little, things to connect to. So let's do regular time, 7:30.
Okay. I'll tell Sheila for
Tuesday,
next Wednesday
next
night.
Wednesday.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you so
Okay,
much, Rabbi.
Okay,
night.
great. Have a
Thank
good
you.
week, everyone.
Thank
We
you,
look
Rabbi.
Thank
forward,
you.
and we'll try to wrap
Thank
it
you.
up then. There's always too much to really wrap up, but we'll do our best.
Yes.